Hi, I'm Regan Robinson, your host of Future Fit, the only podcast unraveling the secrets of how the world's most innovative leaders stay future ready in a fast-paced world. I've spent over 20 years as a futurist and strategist, transforming top global brands and putting investment-backed startups on paths to sustainable growth. Along the way, I've become obsessed with new ways to prepare for the future, because thinking about the long term once a year simply isn't enough. In each episode, I talk with movers, shakers, and path breakers who share their stories about how they turn uncertainty into their strategic advantage. Throughout our journey, we'll discover unconventional and imaginative ways to help you thrive today while leading your teams into tomorrow. Future Fit leaders know that being prepared for what's next is more than a business decision. It's a way of being. Let's venture together as we co-create a new future readiness playbook. The future can't wait, and neither can I. So, are you ready to get future fit? So today I am thrilled to welcome David Mayer, a creative consultant with over 25 years of experience helping companies grow through designing experiences and telling stories that customers, employees, and other audiences find meaningful. Dave is renowned for connecting brands' authentic truth to what matters most to customers, and is senior partner at Lippincott, a global consultancy that creates, grows, and transforms brands to shape businesses, disrupt industries, and define generations. A pioneer since 1943, which I totally love, Lippincott has shaped some of the world's most iconic brands and experiences, and has worked with the likes of Samsung, Starbucks, Delta, and many more. David leads Lippincott's marketing and customer strategy team globally, and in this role, he has worked with diverse companies from startups to multinationals such as Coca-Cola, Hyatt, and Walmart. David has been published by Harvard Business Review, Forbes, the World Economic Forum, and more, and he founded Brand Aperture, an approach to measuring and managing brand equity. David balances IQ with EQ and recognizes that the best of strategies need to be applied pragmatically within complex companies. And so I am incredibly excited to hear what he's going to enlighten us with today. So welcome to the show, David.
Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. Well, let's dive into our conversation with the question that I pose to everyone who joins me on the show, which is, what does future ready mean to you?
I think there's three things that I sort of feel are traits which are useful to have to be future ready. First one's being a voyeur, of just delving into people's lives and truly understanding what's motivating and meaningful to them. And then also looking at the intersection of different disciplines. So I love people who are polymath, because it's where those two disciplines come together that you see novel things happening that you can take advantage of.
Yeah.
The second piece is having a healthy paranoia of recognizing that there's always something next that's coming. And so having a curiosity to see what that next is and how that may impact your own business. And then the last piece is always having a bit of rebellion in you. I think creativity is a little act of rebellion every time you do it. And most companies are incredibly successful because they do what they do very strongly. And that's great in the status quo, but that's tough when the future arrives because people are typically not ready for it.
Yeah, I think I really love that articulation. I think a lot of the characteristics, if you want to call them, of what you shared, from being a voyeur to being rebellious to, embracing multiple perspectives or being able to connect dots in a way, I think is a really great articulation, especially because I always tell people future ready, it is a capability, but it's also a capacity. It's a mindset that actually anybody can cultivate, which is part of what I think makes it so powerful. We can all work on this and really sort of cultivate this capability in ourselves. And the other thing that's coming up for me on the voyeur front, it's about seeing. It's about really seeing and observing and reflecting and marinating. And so I think I always share with people that it's the way that I move through the world now, both personally and professionally. I was sharing with you some horseback riding insights. It's like the way that I see, because of this sort of observational capacity that I've cultivated, especially over the last, I'd say 7 years, it becomes a superpower, because then you start to see things that people aren't seeing. I fundamentally believe that everything is actually right in front of us if we're actually just really looking.
Yeah, and I think it's about getting intimate and vulnerable. We worked with Walmart on their brand transformation a number of years back. And as part of that, we wanted to get into people's homes and truly understand what's the role that grocery plays in their lives. And there's one particular young single mother who we were sitting in her living room, and she had a 5-year-old. And naturally, she said, what he eats is really important to me because I know the value of nutrition. I try and help him make the right choices and get fruit and veg. So we had that good conversation. And then we said, do you mind if we look in your fridge? And then you get that horrible pause, and she opens the fridge and it's all frozen pizzas, at which point you get the real story, which is, I truly want my son to eat well, but I have to work long hours. I pick him up from school. I have very little time to then get him home and get him fed. And so frozen pizzas are the way forward. And that then gives you a whole lot of insight, which says there's a time pressure to modern living. The way that we serve needs to change. And a 100,000 square foot store is a very difficult thing to navigate if you're a young mum and you're time pressured, as well as the pricing piece. And so that then starts giving you the insight that you can then say, how might we change the store environment to better serve that young mum who wants to do something but doesn't feel enabled yet?
Yeah, well, I love that, because and we'll get into insights in a moment, but also what's jumping out at me, and I have it for later on in our conversation, is this idea too that people, don't know what they want. They might not even exactly know what they need. They don't know how to articulate it necessarily, right? And so they have to experience it, right, in order to kind of know what is necessary, what's going to solve their problems.
What you brought up there is a really important point, which is you can't ask consumers what they want because they won't know. And I got a great anecdote, and this is going to date me. Back in 2005, we were working with AOL, who at that point was an internet service provider.
Yes.
And then people started offering free service. So the question is, the future's come forward and your business model's no longer viable. You need to find a new business model. And so we were working with them to help think through what could that new business model be. And there were sort of 3 big ideas that came out: connections, memories, suitcase. If I take connections for a while, this is this idea of, we're just starting to emerge with digital products, particularly cameras. We're going to be creating all of this content. How might we use it? We take that to a focus group and shared a little vignette of how you could share your photos online and have a conversation and stay in touch, hence connections.
Yeah.
And the consumer said, well, that's ridiculous. Why would I share my photos online? I can just get them printed out as usual, and then I can go around someone's house and I can show them. And that route got shut down because there was no demand, and we all know where the world went from there. So that's the danger of unilaterally listening to a consumer rather than showing them what the benefit can be.
100%. I mean, I'm actually pretty blown away by that. If you think about where we are today, in terms of how that just seemed so foreign. And so I think that just really underscores this idea that prototyping, piloting is really important, especially from a future ready and innovation standpoint. But sometimes, this is where sort of visionary thinking comes into play. Sometimes you can't always listen to those who are in your focus group. And fun fact, so I'm going to date myself as well, AOL Red. Do you remember AOL Red?
I actually don't. I may not have made it across to the UK when I was that.
Okay. Well, AOL Red was my client. So there we go.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So we both dated ourselves. Amazing. So now let's talk about insight. So you've written, and I'm phrasing here, that creative consultants thrive at the intersection of storytelling that tugs at the heartstrings and more evidence-based decision-making, and that it's the art alongside the science that reveals an insight that disrupts the status quo and sets new industry standards. And your point of view really resonates with me because I believe that meaning making from insights goes beyond the data, kind of like what we're talking about. It's about tapping into emotional nuances and using imagination and intuition to bring those insights to life. And so, how do you approach sensing what Lippincott's clients could be ready for in the future? And how are you using those insights to creatively think about how they can take advantage of what's coming?
So I think there's sort of two steps to that. First is an understanding of where a particular client is. I like to talk about a window of transformation. So most companies transform when there's been a trigger point that's creating a crisis. It may well be that sales have suddenly dropped off. We've seen the recent news of Starbucks and a change of leadership there.
Yeah.
I think to be back to your sort of observation at the beginning about being future fit, there's huge benefit in recognizing that that window of transformation opened up much earlier, and therefore can you spot and act on it earlier, and therefore the level of disruption needs to be lower. And so first off, it's just to understand where do we think the client is. They may not be in a window of transformation. They may be growing really strongly. And then the question is, how can you continue to evolve the status quo while keeping a lookout for, is that window starting to emerge? And we often look at that window in terms of how meaningful is my brand? There are a lot of categories where a company is successful because their strategic control may be the slots they have in an airport, or that consumers don't readily switch between competitors. But there's a risk that's already giving you a warning flag, which is if that strategic control goes away, for example, during COVID, where slots at airports suddenly opened up, so new airlines could come in, or it may be regulatory, or it may be technology, or it may be market shifting of just someone coming in. For example, Amazon getting involved in movies where it's not seeking to make a profit. So keeping an eye on that. The second one is to say the performance is still good, but you're in a window of transformation. And then the incentives within an organization make it very difficult to move. So we worked for one of the big soda brands, and you could tell that the big growth is all coming outside carbonated beverages. But of course, all of the most successful people in the company came up through carbonated beverages because that was the profit engine. And so helping navigate that change enables you to then say, what can I do differently? And then lastly, you're in a critical phase and you need to act quickly. So irrespective of which state you're in, but knowing the context, you then say, fundamentally being future fit is, can I derive the right insight? And there's sort of two pieces of insight we primarily rely on, again, looking future forward as opposed to current. The first one is what we call experience-based forecasting, which is the premise that the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I'll give you an example from COVID, which was, there were three main dimensions during COVID, which was, have I had a health event? So I've been personally affected by COVID or someone close to me. Are my finances under stress because I've lost my job, particularly if I was in the service industry? And thirdly, is my freedom restricted? I can't do my normal travel. Maybe I can't see loved ones. And what we found is people who had experienced a combination of the three were 40% more likely to have been flying in the previous 3 months. So we were already starting to see what became known as revenge travel, but no one had seen it yet. So you can look at that and say, there are a whole set of behaviors that people who've experienced these events now show. And so you can see that in almost any context. And then the second piece is to say, now I know what I would call my drill site. So revenge travel. We then undertake jobs to be done, which is a form of in-depth interview that really gets at the intimate motivations. And one of my colleagues, Taddy Hall, helped found that discipline with the late Clay Christensen. And I wrote the book Competing Against Luck, which I would thoroughly recommend. And jobs to be done has an underlying exploration of, you hire companies, and I'm going to shift the phrasing of it, that deliver meaning in your life. And that meaning can be emotional, so a form of connection of why do I love this brand? Or it can be meaningful in terms of the progress. It helps you do things you otherwise couldn't. And that progress is either works like magic. So it's setting a new standard. Think of someone like Uber disrupting a market. But actually, the more important driver of progress is social meaning, which is how are you as a brand helping me build relationships with others? And that could be Disney, taking my kids to Disneyland. It could be Pinterest. I love knitting blankets, and Pinterest enables me to interact with a community of people who share that passion. Or it could be more global, like an REI, which is they're fundamentally a force for good in the world. And by understanding through the jobs to be done in the context, for example, of revenge travel, we get a real sense for what will it take to win that emerging behavior that we're seeing. And then if we can help our clients be at the forefront of that, then they can start winning share versus others.
I love that. So I use the jobs to be done framework in my programs and in my work with the executives as well. So I'm a huge fan. That's why I was smiling so big. I'm like, yes, I love it. I love it. Because you really have to have that customer perspective. And I love that, or the 5 whys framework to really try to get at the root cause of needs. But if I take a step back, it sounds like your approach is you start with the assessment, the current state of where a company is in their transformation journey, right? And are you looking at that not only from a market perspective, but perhaps what internally the company, because as we know, that oftentimes is what's getting in the way, right? Is like, what is the culture? What are the internal barriers that could prevent us from changing or transforming? And then once you sort of figure out where that particular client is on perhaps a spectrum, then you start to flip it to the outside in, if you will, around what are some of the behavioral insights that we can gather and use that as sort of another lens by which to assess the opportunity, and then bringing in the jobs to be done framework to kind of add more context to the solutions that you can bring to market.
Yeah, and the jobs to be done enables you to get to a true insight that's revealing about what is it that's going to be new to this customer that we can bring. And then I think there's a benefit of Lippincott being a creative consulting firm rather than an agency, is you have to have the creativity to say, from that insight, what is it that we're going to serve them that's going to deliver connection and also progress? But you also have to have the science underpinning the sort of the management consulting side, which says, why will this firm be better at doing that than anyone else?
Right.
How are they going to make money from it? What are the organizational structures you need in order to deliver it? And and if it's profitable, then others are going to come in. What's our strategic control to say we will continue to lead with it? So it's thinking about sort of 3 things. So 1, where do we move to where the consumer's going to be, or customer in B2B? 2, how do we build a value proposition that it can engagingly and profitably serve both in the short minimum viable product, but also long term? And then 3, how can we work with the organization and the culture to overcome the inherent inertia that says, except in crisis, why do we need to do this, and take resources away from what's a very successful current state?
Right. Well, I think what's really important too to highlight or underscore is this coupling of the business model and business strategy aspect with everything else that you're talking about, which would maybe be more of a marketing function, right? Because I feel like that, we were talking about Beanie Babies, right? In our warm-up chat, like sort of that was definitely a pure marketing play that was not underpinned by a lot of business fundamentals or really a long-term business strategy. And if you're going to be a future-ready brand that is continuously ahead of the curve, marketing might get you to a certain point for a little while, but it's not going to be enough to sustain.
Yeah, and I think as marketers, we can sometimes be undervalued in companies, because there's the age-old challenge, which is our discipline is this balance of measurement and belief. And if you go purely what you can measure, you end up with very short-term digitally focused metrics, and that can be very limiting. But rightly, the CFO is saying, well, if I'm going to give you this investment, what can you show as a return? So I think first job as marketers is to demonstrate the value. And that is going to be a bit of measurement and belief. But I think demonstrating this is more than we're as good as last week's numbers and getting off the hamster wheel. But also as marketers, with a creative heart of any organization. And so how do we make use of that creativity and get pulled into other areas of the business to apply it, rather than risk being pushed into a box which says we're a demand generation adjunct? Because I think that's a very limited view of the value that marketing can bring.
100%. Well, the Beanie Baby case study would be an example of a pure, demand generation play, right? Scarcity and demand generation. That's exactly, and it worked for a while, but certainly not from a long-term perspective. And I think the idea of valuing marketing and making the case or the connective tissue between the actual business value that is driven from creativity and marketing, sort of that heart piece, I think is really important, especially today. And the brands that win are the ones that are connecting with the hearts of people. And those are the ones that are creating sort of the longer term and more loyal relationships. And you also mentioned measurement, which I think is a great transition into my next question. So you've talked about how a brand's current strategy needs to prepare to serve their customers of the future by prioritizing the customer's experiences, and that resilient go-to brands that also drive loyalty, so not Beanie Babies, also help people do something that they couldn't do before, that it is about progress. And I really find this compelling because future readiness is really all about proactively anticipating evolving needs and creating value that moves beyond the present. And so I'm curious, how do you approach measuring progress when it comes to new and novel experiences? And what advice would you offer to leaders who are struggling with even starting to help their customers do something they couldn't do before?
So measurement is a polarizing topic because you talk with a lot of creatives and measurement is seen as a straitjacket, and rightly so. And I like to say that measurement should inform but not constrain creativity. It tends to be backwards looking. And that's why we develop things like experience-based forecasting to give you some sense of using backwards looking to predict forward. But the progress is really tough. Like connection, making yourself loved is tough. But I think arguably that's an easier thing for us to do when you understand, like we all understand human motivations. Progress, and I'll come back to two components of progress. First one, the work like magic. Like creating something that opens new markets is really tough to do it once. To do it on an ongoing basis is magical. And there are very few companies in the world that succeeded it. And I'll give you an example of someone who's done it in a mature category. If we take Hoka, there have been running shoes for decades, and there's some really big players like Nike. What Hoka did was being that voyeur and getting really into runners who were feeling a bit left out, not as much of a celebrity there. And so that's not where the incumbents had gone. And so they understood what runners were looking for was cushioning, but also reducing weight. And they've designed that iconic Hoka look. The second piece of progress is the social aspect to it. So what Hoka also did was they've been participating in local running clubs in a way that none of the other shoe manufacturers have. And they've really built that community. And while it's tough to see how you're going to continue making technology advances, they'll continue to come, but they're challenging to do. The social aspect and just being associated with that running group is going to help keep Hoka moving forward and be more meaningful to that audience. The challenge will come for Hoka, which says, as you continue to grow and you move into adjacent categories, can you keep that social progress being as relevant for a broader set of people?
Interesting. So it sounds like what you're saying is that you are, from a progress standpoint, one thing that you're looking at is what is the innovation to be had where maybe the incumbents or the category leaders are not solving for, and then and what is sort of the product innovation, if you will, or experience that we can create around that. And then two, looking at it from a cultural and social perspective, you have these folks who feel left out from maybe the Nike, professional athlete or like super fit or Olympic sort of vibe, but yet they're a dedicated and passionate culture and like tribe of consumers. And then how can you sort of build something around that to really maximize what you're doing?
Yes. And then if you're the incumbent, you're probably using measurement to give you a sense of how meaningful is my brand remaining as I grow. And this is where I'm a passionate believer, which says NPS, which the majority of companies use as the measure, is incredibly powerful at helping you go from being bad to good. It's very limited in helping you understand how to go from good to great, or to identify when you're slipping back and going from great back to. And primarily the reason for that is twofold. One is any single metric is only looking at one aspect of the relationship. Right. So I would strongly encourage everyone to say, yes, continue to use recommendation and net promoter, but other metrics like progress, connection, momentum, value ratio, all give you a different part of the relationship. And what you'll find is that the factors that drive those outcomes, they'll be similar, but they'll have different importance. And only when you start to measure more broadly will you understand what's going on there.
Interesting. So for our audience, in case they don't know, NPS is net promoter score, right? And that basically measures word of mouth.
That's right. Thank you. Yeah, and that's the second challenge with it, which is what you recommend is related but slightly different from what you will personally choose. So, for example, in credit cards, and this goes before it was in your digital wallet, so still think of it as the plastic card you put down in front of a cashier. One of the most important drivers for personal choice of who you chose was, what does that card say about me? If I have an Amex, it says I'm successful and important. If I have Virgin card, it says I'm cool and a little bit hip.
Yep.
I'm not going to recommend based off that because I'll look a little bit foolish. You tend to recommend on what's not going to create a problem that comes back. So you're much more risk averse on the measures of what you recommend. So I'm going to recommend something that just works, because also I don't want to assume that you're the type of person who would appreciate Virgin. And so again, the danger of NPS is it can limit and make you focus on things that aren't most important in brand preference. Now, recommendation word of mouth is really critical too. So that's why it's beneficial to understand. But we know senior leadership don't have attention for a lot of different measures, but as marketers, we really need to understand the breadth and be nuanced about what we do as a result of what we see.
Yeah. Oh, well, nuances, I think, is a great word for this part of our conversation. And my takeaway is kind of what you said at the top of our conversation, with that you have to take this multi-dimensional perspective. Never is one data point enough. And in fact, you need multiple data points. And that's where I believe the imagination, the intuition really come into play, because you don't want to get hung up in data paralysis or focusing too much on the information, right? It's this art and science. I try to avoid using the word balance, but it's the only one that's coming up to mind, so I'm going to use it right now. But it's this balance between what is the data telling us, but wait a second, but what also is our intuition and our imagination perhaps telling us, and where can these two things potentially meet to envision something new or bust the status quo or push the consumer further.
And this is your point about sort of the balance of the science and art, which was, if I take another example, which was Suitcase, we've created all of these digital assets that we want to access from wherever we are. So we didn't call it the cloud back there, but it was, is there a networked way to store things? And so we identify that as a growing need. The way it was chosen to be solved then was an acquisition of a company that had effectively recreated Windows Explorer online, as opposed to saying creatively, what might you take advantage of a totally different medium? And that's where I like to think of a graphic equalizer. Depending on sort of where you are in the journey, you need to dial up or dial down the balance of measurement versus belief.
Yeah. Well, I think this is where adjacencies are particularly powerful as well. It's like, how can you leverage some of your pre-existing assets and not start from like square one, right? And move, take components of what you're doing really well, or components of your intellectual property or your secret sauce, and then reapply it and deliver it in a new context or an entirely different way to an audience that is going to think that it is super innovative. That's why I always go back to imagination, because that's what imagination is about: connecting dots and applying things in fresh contexts. It doesn't necessarily mean inventing something entirely new and novel.
Absolutely. I'm all in favor of looking around you, seeing what works, but then connecting it in novel ways. So my personal experience, I left Lippincott for a couple of years to run a design consultancy that specialized in building category solutions in store. And I just learned an enormous expansion of the role of design in that particular craft. When I came back to Lippincott, I combined that with that insight from Walmart, and we helped ShopRite, which is a Northeast grocer, develop Fresh to Table, which was, it was lovely to take an insight from 20 years ago and say no one's acted on it. And actually, it got even worse, which is more and more people are saying, I don't have time to shop a 60,000 square foot supermarket. It's not even a Walmart supermarket. I need to pop in and in 5 minutes grab what I want for dinner. And because no supermarket's doing that particularly well, I'm ending up going to fast food. And I don't want to go to fast food, but they're the ones who are solving the immediate job. And so Fresh to Table said, let's just take fresh and grab and go, heat and eat, prep and eat, and just pull it into 1,500 square foot at the front of store, separate checkout, do it beautifully. And suddenly you've created a concept which says, now I can enable you not only to match what fast food can give you, but with healthier food. But secondly, people want to participate in prep, this making together time for people. They just don't have time to do it from scratch. So if we pre-cut vegetables and fruit, A, you can charge a lot more for it. B, it's highly valued. And that actually became the biggest growth area within that Fresh to Table set. Just something very simple: consumer wins and the retailer wins.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of examples of, again, it goes back to, I always say everything is in front of us if we're just really looking. And it doesn't necessarily to innovate or to expand into a new market or to seize an adjacency. There's a lot in front of you if you just take a more imaginative and creative lens and say, okay, what's the opportunity here? And a lot of that actually requires then dialing back all the noise. That's when simplicity and things like that really become important. And that's why I always say well-being is the foundation of the work that I do, because you have to actually be taking care of yourself and really healthy in order to see things and process all the information and separate the signals from the noise. If you're actually healthy in all of its forms, well-being in all of its forms, mentally, physically, emotionally, financially, socially, right? Then you're actually able, in my own personal experiences, is I've been able to see those adjacencies and those white spaces, which with much less effort, if you will.
And then you get to that fantastic insight and you deliver the creativity to say, I've now got something that delivers on that insight. The last step is you've got to persuade your peers to get on board. And so when people ask me what a creative consultant is, I think in its simplest way, it's to diagnose the difference in the balance in storytelling. So any one of your listeners who are ex-management consultants, there's the Management Consultant Bible is Barbara Minto's pyramid principle, which is a beautifully deductive, I've got a situation as a complication, and now I'm going to tell you the solution because of A, B, C, and it builds sort of pyramids of evidence. Very deductive. If you're in a big company, it gives you the confidence that you've got a you've made the right decision. Even if it ends up being wrong, you can say, look, here's all the evidence. I was smart. I did it. And then on the other side, you've got Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And for anyone who's watched a Disney film, I've got a hero, they suffer a setback, and they set off on a journey of redemption and ultimately end up in a phenomenal place. I can't give you evidence for why that journey is the right way, but boy, do we feel it's the right way. And so in order, particularly for this future fit again, where there is no deductive way to get to the future, I can de-risk it with the pyramid principle, but ultimately I've got to ask you to take a leap of faith. And that leap of faith, creativity, being master storytellers, all comes back to why marketers should be such a valued contributor to keeping companies relevant.
Yeah. Well, and what's jumping out at me is the, leap of faith part of what you said. And what's coming up for me, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is this experimentation aspect and like willing to try something, even if you may fail, right? And so I think that's a really lovely segue into where I'd like to go next, which is around this idea of piloting experiences or prototyping, if you will. And there's a quote I'd love to share that I love, which is, prototyping is the conversation you have with your ideas. And this really strikes a chord with me because, like prototyping, future readiness includes exploring the future's possibilities in ways that make those possibilities more tangible. Now, in our last chat that we had a month ago, you said that unlike traditional management consulting firms, and it's come up a bit on our conversation today, Lippincott is able to translate insight into action by designing and piloting experiences, or prototyping, if you will. So I'm curious, in what ways do you see prototyping or piloting as a key component of future readiness, and how does it help your clients push their customers forward?
So I think three sort of considerations, which is, I don't believe you can do great strategy unless you have a good experience and understanding of how you implement that strategy. Otherwise, I think there's a risk of being a little bit naive of it's a great idea on paper, and then once you start to get into build, you just find pieces of value proposition that don't work together.
Yeah.
Secondly, this is the slowest time we're going to experience in our lives. The pace of change is increasing ever faster. And if you end up saying, I need to do a whole sort of research to check if this idea is a good one before we go into starting to build, you're going to be too slow and other people are going to come in.
Right.
Last piece is that research is likely to be wrong because, again, you can only simulate what the future is in research, and that comes with some pretty big limitations. So what a pilot allows you to do is it lets your target audience experience. It also lets you experience and work out the wrinkles. So if I come back to fresh to table, we had a belief that because people were going to fast food, they just wanted to be able to come in, pick up a dinner and go home. So we brought together different ingredients and put them in one place, and it was dinner for tonight. So it's a meat, 2 veg, very convenient, pre-cut. And you know what? Customers in our early conversations had said, that's really interesting. No one bought it. And then you can have a conversation about, well, why aren't you choosing this? And you get the reasons why. And then you go, actually, the idea is not wrong, but the way it's executed isn't how we thought it would work. And then you can rapidly change it. And because we've got the prototype in store, you can get feedback every 24 hours because you just set up something new and you're learning. So your pace of learning will go much faster. And also because you've got it in place, your ability to say, once I've got something that's feeling and demonstrating performance, I can now scale it very quickly. And so you're going to learn faster, and ultimately you're going to be able to enter and win a market more effectively than if you take a more cautious approach. And your point's really well made, which is a lot of the pieces are going to fail, and failure is the wrong word. It's more, we're going to learn a lot from it. And we've just got to be pretty aggressive about saying at different milestones, is it achieving what we need it to do in order to get the next investment? Or is this was a great idea, we tried it, we've learned a lot, but now we need to put the investment elsewhere. I think many companies also lack the courage to shut down things. and therefore are resistant to move too far forward without evidence.
Because they fear I'm admitting I was wrong, right? This is where a lot of the work I do is around this culture shifting and mindset shifting and addressing sort of the fear and ego that I believe that gets in the way of future readiness and this ability to experiment, right? And be comfortable with it. And I think piloting is really powerful because it's a hands-on approach that accelerates your understanding and your customers' understanding of what it is you're trying to do and their adoption. And then, as you said earlier, it sort of opens up new possibilities that you would have only known had you shipped it, if you will, if you'd actually tried to bring some form of it to market. And so back to the point earlier that we were talking about, it's just people may not always be able to articulate their desires, but they do recognize the value of something when they encounter it, right? And I think that's really important from a future readiness, especially when you're in the space of like, how are we going to solve problems or push our customers progress their lives in a way that they're still struggling with that no one else in the market has actually solved for.
And I think it's important to say, don't put all your eggs in one basket, which is things are going to fail. And particularly if we're being creative, we want them to fail because that's where we learn. So think about the portfolio, the seeds that you're planting. You only need one or two of them to bear fruit. But if you haven't planted many seeds, you can't prejudge which of the seeds is going to be most successful.
Yes, yes. Well, I love the garden and gardener metaphor. I use that often in my work. I think it's a very powerful one. So now it's funny that you brought up William Gibson's quote about the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed, because that quote really resonates with me. As I've said a few times in our conversation, the future is here. It's right in front of us if we're really looking. And so Lippincott CEO Rick Wise recently said that your priority has always been strategic evolution and to stay ahead of client needs. But this work, as we both know, is not easy. And so I'm curious, what gaps or difficulties are you facing when strategizing for Lippincott's future? And what wisdom would you offer for leaders who are struggling with similar challenges?
So I think we've been very blessed by our founders, Gordon Lippincott and Walter Margulies. One was an engineer and one was an architect. So I think by happenstance, they wove together this combination of strategic rigor and creativity, which are two fairly contrasting disciplines that are a bit like oil and water. And so from the founding of Lippincott in 1943, we found a way to make them work and respect the two that come together. And so we started off and Gordon coined the term corporate identity, of sort of creating corporate brands. And then the nature of branding has always been in constant evolution. So corporate identity, that naturally takes you into storytelling of how do we externally evangelize and bring you in. Then you see in the 90s, the rise of social networking, 24-hour news means experience is now the dominant builder of brand that you can amplify with storytelling, but you can't conflict the two. And if we're getting into experience, then we need to drive innovation. How do we push progress? How do we create connection? But also many of our clients are in service businesses, so naturally you get into culture. So now how do I mobilize them? Go-to brands are best built from the inside out. So not just how am I meaningful to customers, how am I meaningful to employees? And if I'm going to grow, then I need to get funding from investors. I need to be thinking more broadly about my audiences. So you can start to see how sort of every part of our growth and history, we've continually had to evolve who we are and how we serve our clients. And so Rick, who's been leading us for over 15 years, I think has always been able to see what the path is forward. And I would say the bigger challenge is when I joined in 2003, I think we were just under 100 people. And then if you see the path, it's a fairly informal conversation around what do we need to do to navigate to that path. We're now much larger. And so we're clear on the path. And the question is now with a bigger organization, how do we bring people with us and adapt to that change? So we're less the sort of agile sports car and more the emerging oil tanker in the world of branding. So the question becomes, you need to remain agile, because we said the change is happening ever faster. And so I'm less worried about our ability to diagnose where we need to go, and more a question of how do we get there?
Yeah. Well, and this agility is a word that is thrown around a lot and for purposes of lip service and more. And I think a lot of people, oh yeah, we're agile. And then as I start to dig in, ask lots of questions, it becomes very clear to me that either they don't understand what it means, or they're living in a fantasy world, because they're actually not. That agility is much harder to foster and cultivate inside a company than people actually realize. And so I just wanted to double click under that, because it's not a throwaway thing. It's actually really important. And then the last thing I'm taking away from our conversation is, it sounds like in the DNA of your company is this duality and this ambidextrous thinking that I think is really powerful. Like the ability to flex these seemingly oppositional muscles, I think is incredibly important if you're going to be a future ready leader and a future ready company. So I think it's really awesome what you guys are doing.
Thank you. We enjoy it. And many of us have been here. 25 years is not that unusual in our company. So we tend to stick around.
Yeah, that's incredible and speaks volumes. So a final question before you share where our listeners can find you. In your view, is preparing for the future more about managing risks or capitalizing on opportunities?
Oh, it's a juggling act. I think it depends. You sit on that window of transformation. I think if you are in that pre-window, then I would focus more on risks. Like, when's that window appearing? If I'm in the window, most companies over-index on managing risk and they don't grasp the opportunity. And that's where I would say grasp the opportunity. It's going to take creativity. What worked in the past won't work in the future. You can't measure your way out of it.
Yeah, I love that. And with that, where can people go to find out more about you and your work, David?
Come to us at lippincott.com, LIPPINCOTT.
Marvelous. Well, thank you so much for your time and your thought-provoking insights, David. It's been enlightening, and I've had so much fun exploring with you today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on your show.
Pleasure was all mine.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Future Fit. If you're listening, you're probably future curious. So follow me in my newsletter on LinkedIn to keep the conversation going and share your discoveries with the Future Fit community. And if you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe, rate, and review Future Fit on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time.